Missouri's top business association is now speaking out against a measure to increase the minimum wage in the state of Missouri. WGEM Capitol reporter Hannah Falcon spoke with people on both sides to understand their arguments.
In less than 6 weeks, Missourians will decide whether or not to raise the minimum wage from $12.30 an hour to $15 an hour by 2026. Then in 2027, minimum wage would be adjusted each year based on inflation and the cost of living.
This could increase the cost of doing business and drive up costs not just to businesses, but to consumers as well, who are already fighting the effects of record inflation.
Kara Korchis, president of the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry, tells me this could be bad for Missouri business. Missouri's minimum wage is already higher than surrounding states, and Korchis says raising it could drive businesses out of state.
We generally oppose any new mandate on businesses.
It's not on me to tell other businesses like what's good for them.
Mike Draper owns a t-shirt print shop, Raygun, in Kansas City. While increasing the minimum wage would not affect how much he pays employees because he already pays more, Draper thinks it means fewer people taking advantage of federal assistance programs to make ends meet.
Where I get frustrated is when you have large corporations that essentially exploit the low minimum wage and then use my tax money through federal subsidies to make up the cost of living adjustment that employees need.
In addition to raising the minimum wage, Proposition A also requires businesses to provide employees with paid sick leave. Reporting in Jefferson City, I'm Hannah Falcon, WGEM News.